According to the Texas Center for the Missing, there were 543,018 missing person reports filed in 2020, with only about 1% of those being classified as stranger abductions. There are also over 19,000 cold cases in the state of Texas alone, with some of these cases spanning back to the 1940s and 1950s. With each year that passes, it becomes harder and harder to gather evidence in these cold cases. Most times, it just takes the right person with the right information to come forward to defrost the cold case. Number 5. Houston, Texas in 1979 was not a peaceful place to live, judging by the statistics. At the start of the 1970s, there were 40,987 violent crimes recorded, and by 1979, that number had jumped to 67,988. That doesn't include the slew of other crimes and the unsolved cases that baffled investigators. In 1979, Houston recorded 2,235 homicides, and as the residents of Houston welcomed in the 1980s, those statistics only began to worsen. This boom came with a boom in population, as hundreds of people flocked to Houston to be a part of the oil industry, leaving their small towns behind. Attitudes toward crime have certainly changed in the last few decades, and now more than ever, we are well versed in prevention and safety tips. In 2021, hitchhiking is an immediate no-go, but in the 1970s it was common practice. Thousands of women and men met their end after being picked up by the wrong person. But that doesn't mean that evil doesn't lurk in other places too. Our home is our safe space, and the idea of being a victim in our own homes shatters any notions of safety and tranquility that we may have. While we think we're untouchable while sitting at home, watching TV, or sleeping, the truth of the matter is that we're not. 33-year-old Alice Rankin worked as a secretary at an engineering firm in Houston, Texas, and had gotten herself a fancy new apartment at the Orchard apartment complex located on the 5900th block of Glenmont. Sadly, not much else is known about Alice, and much of what we do know is in regards to the unsolved crime that was committed against her. On the morning of July 27, 1979, Bob Smith arrived at the Orchard apartment complex to pick Alice up and take her to work. Alice was getting a ride with Bob as her car was in for repairs, so Bob stepped up and kindly offered to pick her up and drop her off. Bob waited outside for a few minutes, hoping that Alice would come running down the stairs and bundle herself into his car, uttering a string of apologies along the way. But after a few minutes had passed, there was no sign of Alice. Bob got out of his car and walked towards her apartment to make sure that everything was okay. What Bob saw that sunny July morning will haunt him for the rest of his life. As Bob neared closer to Alice's apartment, he noticed that the door was unlocked and slightly ajar. Strange, he thought. He entered the apartment, calling Alice's name as he went, thinking that perhaps she'd had an accident and needed his help. After searching through the rooms of the apartment, he came upon Alice's bedroom. There he found Alice, laid on her back. A pillow was over her head, but as Bob lifted the pillow, he noticed that the space was empty. Panicked and shocked, Bob ran to the phone and called for the police, rousing neighbors in the process and sending the apartment complex into a state of panic. When speaking to the Houston Chronicle, Bob Smith recalled that day, saying, quote, "I looked over my shoulder and had that feeling that if the person who did this was still around, he'd get me." The Houston Police Department and their forensic investigation team was summoned to the scene and cordoned it off to the best of their ability. A shaken Bob was taken aside and questioned thoroughly as investigators tried to ascertain as much detail from him as possible. Bob was quickly ruled out as a suspect, and for the Houston investigators, the game was on. Those who lived in the Orchard apartment complex were terrified to be in their own homes, most especially 27-year-old Mary CALCUTTA. Mary had recently moved into the apartment complex looking for independence and a new start. She had certainly found it in Houston and was described by all those who knew her as lively and vibrant. Her older brother Jim told the Post-Gazette, quote, "She wanted to get out of a rut, not just be in Pittsburgh doing what she was doing. There was a whole world out there and a lot to be experienced." Mary thrived in her own environment, and coming from a large Catholic family, she knew how to charm people and make friends with ease. She joined a new church and became fast friends with a group of people her age at the church. They would look out for each other and spend their free time together whenever possible. Every time she spoke on the phone or sent a letter to her family, Mary glowed about her new life in Houston, telling them that she couldn't wait for the next few years and to see what they had in store for her. Little did Mary know that behind Houston's boom was a terrible dark side that would quickly catch up to her. According to Jem, Mary felt safe and secure in the Orchard apartment complex, as it was filled with numerous young professionals like herself. There were no creepy neighbors or unwanted guests loitering around, and Mary felt that she had made the right decision in moving there. That was until July 27, 1979, when the news of Alice Rankin's passing broke. Newspapers and TV stations in the area were quick to broadcast the details, and the once calm atmosphere of the Orchard apartment complex quickly turned into a chaotic one. Mary CALCUTTA was deeply troubled by this news, and confided in her family and close friends that for the first time since arriving in Houston, she was afraid for her safety. Mary didn't know it yet, but she had every right to be concerned. This crime had shaken Mary so deeply that she stayed with a friend at her apartment, not wanting to be home alone and constantly looking over her shoulder. When almost 2 weeks had passed, Mary faced her fears and returned to her apartment, not knowing that very shortly she would come face to face with the very madman that she was so desperately trying to avoid. One of Mary's friends told investigators that Mary had taken to barricading her front door with a bookshelf whenever she was home, so that an intruder could not slip in as easily as they had done to Alice's apartment. She also stepped up her personal security efforts by not answering the door to strangers and becoming very paranoid about those around her. On August 10, 1979, a male friend who has never been named made his way to Mary's apartment. It's unknown whether the front door had been left ajar like Alice's, or whether it was closed but unlocked. Either way, Mary's male friend entered the apartment and a chill ran down his spine. He knew something was very wrong. He raced through the apartment before landing at the bathroom door. Inside the bathroom was Mary, lying on the floor. The Houston Police Department once again descended upon the Orchard apartment complex for the second time in 2 weeks. Mary CALCUTTA had succumbed to her wounds, but investigators noted that there was a sign of an intense struggle, stating that Mary had fought her attacker like no one in the force had ever seen before. For the second time in 2 weeks, the local newspapers ran headlines about yet another crime committed at the Orchard apartment complex. If the residents of Houston hadn't been terrified by the first crime, they certainly were now, and women who lived alone desperately tried to buddy up and find roommates or reinforce their homes or apartments to prevent them from befalling the same fate. There were 3 other crimes committed within close proximity to the Orchard apartment murders, but these crimes have never been conclusively linked via forensics. The pressure on the Houston Police Department grew and grew as more and more details about the crimes were published. Detective D.M. Fultz made a statement on August 11, 1979 in The Bulletin, saying, quote, "We've got 500,000 suspects and no one in jail. It's always a possibility they could be related. There's a good possibility they're not." As the pressure continued to mount, Mary's family offered up a $25,000 reward for information. But this wasn't enough to make anyone come forward. As of 2021, this reward still hasn't been enough to prompt anyone to come out, and Mary's surviving family are hoping that one tip could blow open the entire investigation. As the crimes took place in 1979, There wasn't much consideration placed on preserving DNA evidence, as this technique was only just being explored by a few laboratories around the US. The best evidence that the police had to work with was fingerprints, hair, fibers, or any other biological sample that a perpetrator may leave behind. However, in these cases, it appears that there were none. Mary's parents told investigators that they firmly believed she had been attacked by someone she knew. She'd been very paranoid and cautious about who she let into her apartment, and told friends that she wouldn't open the door for anyone she didn't know. This points to the person responsible being someone Mary knew from work, her social life, or it could have been someone from her social circle, or another resident at the apartment complex. If Mary knew that this person resided at the complex, perhaps she wouldn't have questioned seeing them outside of her apartment a little too often. It's clear that the person responsible for these attacks is meticulous and organized, planning his crimes down to every last detail. Despite a widespread investigation and a cash reward, the Houston Police Department is still no closer to solving the case than they were in 1979. In 2010, the case was re-examined by Houston's Cold Case Squad, and evidence recovered from both crime scenes was sent in for analysis. Unfortunately, no DNA could be obtained from these. Although now in 2021, we have a much more robust technique to extract even the most negligible DNA profiles. For the families of Alice and Mary, 42 years is far too long to be without answers, and their cases need to be solved. Fran Calcutta spoke to the Post-Gazette in 2009 and gave a heart-wrenching interview, saying, quote, "You look at some of the pictures from when we were little, and you just wonder how she would have turned out. You're thinking, what if? With all this new technology available, I hope it's just a matter of time before the person who did this is arrested. The person responsible, if these crimes are of one person, should not go unknown for the sake of the families and the loved ones who could find some measure of comfort in the truth." End quote. The Orchard apartment murders have remained unsolved for 42 years, and that's 42 years too long. Anyone with information is urged to come forward, no matter how small or insignificant you believe it may be. It may just be the tip that blows the case wide open. If you have any information, you're asked to contact the Houston Police Department's Cold Case Squad at 713-308-3618. Number 4. Lovers' lanes are popular spots used by young people to sneak away for a few moments of privacy and intimacy, away from the prying eyes of their parents. Many lovers' lanes are situated on dead-end roads or overlooking cityscapes or other landmarks, providing a perfect backdrop to whatever romantic encounter may be taking place. Lovers' lanes are also a hotspot for crime, with criminals taking advantage of young people who are in isolated areas and using that opportunity to steal from them or do something even worse. In the summer of 1990, CHERYL Henry was spending her summer vacation from Stephen F. Austin State University, looking for things to pass the time. During that summer, she met 22-year-old Andy Atkinson, who had recently moved back to Houston, Texas after graduating from college in North Carolina, with the hopes of securing a job and kickstarting his career. CHERYL and Andy were introduced to each other through mutual friends in early August of 1990, and the pair hit it off immediately. By August 22nd, the two had been dating for around 2 weeks and were in the exciting, blossoming phase of a new relationship. CHERYL and her sister, Shane, organized to go on a double date, with both of them bringing along their significant others. By all accounts, the double date went well. The four went to Bayou Mama's Club and spent most of the evening there. From around 11 p.m. to 11:30 p.m., the four decided to call it a night and hung up their dancing shoes. Shane turned to her big sister, kissed her, and said, "I love you," and wished her a good night, knowing that they would see each other again in the morning and have a good gossip about their dates. But for Shane, that conversation never came. When she awoke the next morning, the house was eerily quiet, and there was no sign of CHERYL. Disturbingly, Andy had also failed to return home after their double date. And when the two families called each other to inquire about the whereabouts of their children, it became glaringly obvious that something was wrong. Little did they know that within a matter of hours, their loved ones would be tangled up in one of Texas's most bizarre, unexplained mysteries. Within hours, the two had been reported missing, and the search began with the police searching high and low for the missing lovers. Then, on the evening of August 23, 1990, a Houston patrol car driving down the 1300 block of Enclave Parkway made a grisly discovery. Andy's white Honda Civic stood empty at the spot used by young people in the area as a lover's lane. This sent alarm bells ringing in the patrol officer's head, and he decided to get a closer look at the car and run the plates. When the officer approached the car, he saw that the windows had been wound down, the keys were still in the ignition, and that there was fresh blood splattered around the car. The officer also noted that the seats had been laid back and that a woman's handbag and shoes were found in the passenger seat. Upon running the plates, the officer discovered that the car belonged to Andy Atkinson, who, along with his girlfriend, CHERYL, had been reported missing that very morning. The patrol officer reached for his radio and called for backup, alerting his fellow officers to his discovery. Soon, squad cars with flashing lights and blaring sirens descended on the scene, and the missing person investigation took a dark turn. The police brought in sniffer dogs to help them in their search, and just 200 yards away from Andy's car, they found something very bizarre. Laid neatly in the path were a golf club and 3 golf balls that were aligned, pointing to a piece of fence. As the police lifted the fence, they discovered the body of CHERYL Henry. A $20 bill had also been placed beside her, leaving the police and forensic investigators to wonder whether these items had greater meaning and significance. It wasn't until the next morning, August 24, 1990, that they came across Andy's body, 100 yards from where CHERYL had been found. His body had been propped up against a tree, and none of his personal belongings had been stolen, thus completely ruling out robbery as a motive. Houston police worked with the theory that CHERYL and Andy had headed up to the lover's lane in order to get some privacy, hence the reclined seats. It was at this point that police believed they would have been interrupted by someone. They also worked with the theory that homicide was the perpetrator's main motive, and that he hadn't been trolling the area just to steal from young people up on the lane. With this in mind, they faced the very real possibility that they had a serial killer on their hands. DNA samples were obtained from CHERYL and Andy, and compared to known offenders with a similar MO, but no matches came up. Months passed and the investigation had reached a standstill, leaving CHERYL and Andy's family frustrated and heartbroken at the lack of progress. On the 12th of March, 2001, a mysterious note appeared in the classified section of the Houston Chronicle, which read, quote, "If you want to know who killed C. Henry and A. Atkinson, it will cost $100,000. A lawyer will be hired to make sure you play straight." Publishers at the Houston Chronicle contacted the Houston Police Department, and in return, they posted an advertisement which read, quote, "We do want to know what you know about Henry and Atkinson." The advertisement then advised the original writer to either contact the detectives or have their lawyer contact their detectives on a provided phone number with a sentence that read, quote, "with directions on playing it straight." The Houston Police Department eagerly awaited the phone call, posting someone to man the phones 24/7 in case the all-important call came in at an ungodly hour. But that call never came. Detectives assigned to the case began to believe that the advert had been a cruel hoax, but never gave up hope that someone would eventually come forward with information. Thomas Gillen provided a thought-provoking insight into the minds of killers who contact authorities in 2002, when he published an article to the Journal of Criminal Justice and Popular Culture, writing, quote, "Although these perpetrators injected themselves into cases, sometimes repeatedly for years with poems, letters, and telephone calls to investigators or the news media, The communications did not lead to enough investigative evidence to clues to put an immediate end to the crimes. It wasn't until 2008 that another break in the case came in the form of DNA evidence. In 2008, the medical examiner's office submitted the DNA samples found on CHERYL and Andy to CODIS, and they were surprised when they got a hit to another unknown offender who had committed a similar crime just months earlier in Houston, Texas. On the night of June 20th, 1990, an unknown woman, who we'll call Miss X, left her job at Gigi's, an adult bar, and headed back to her boyfriend's home located at 7826 CALCUTTA in Houston. That evening, her boyfriend was out of town, so she was home alone. She made herself something to eat and got herself ready for bed. According to the official police report, Miss X walked up the stairs to go to her bedroom, and she was ambushed by a man who had been waiting for her. The man tauntingly asked, "Where's Randy?" which was the name of her boyfriend, indicating that he may have been following her in order to figure out her routine and strike when he knew she would be home alone. The man ordered Miss X into the bedroom. When he was finished, he stayed in the house for a few more minutes and disconnected the phone lines before vanishing into the darkness. Miss X was able to run to a neighbor's house and get their attention once she knew that the coast was clear, and the Houston police were immediately dispatched to the scene. A DNA sample was obtained and uploaded to CODIS by forensic scientists in the hopes that the offender's profile was already on there. Sadly, it wasn't. The Houston police asked Miss X to work with a sketch artist and produce an approximation sketch, and she described him as a white man, mid-30s, 6 feet tall, 180 pounds with brown hair, brown eyes, olive skin, and possibly a mustache. She also told investigators that the man had worn fishnet tights over his face and was wearing black gloves, a dark shirt, and dark pants that looked like a uniform. Interestingly, during the attack, he taunted Miss X, telling her that he was wearing a military uniform. However, this may have been a diversion tactic to take away from the fact that he was wearing something else, such as a security guard uniform. As the attacker's DNA had been uploaded to CODIS, when investigators ran the DNA found on CHERYL and Randy, they received a match. They didn't have a name, but they did have an approximation sketch and a survivor that they could talk to. With this in mind, is it possible that the attacker wore a security guard or police uniform on the night that he attacked CHERYL and Randy? First attending officers noticed that Andy's car had the windows rolled down, possibly indicating that he had rolled them down in order to speak to someone, like a police officer. According to an article published in 2008, CHERYL had worked at a club similar to the one that Miss X had worked at, and Andy also casually worked as a doorman at another club. It's unknown whether the perpetrator found his victims while at these clubs, or whether CHERYL and Andy were merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were also a string of mysterious disappearances around the time that CHERYL and Andy were found. No other cases, apart from Miss X, have ever been conclusively linked to CHERYL and Andy's case. But the Houston Police Department cannot rule out the possibility of a serial killer being involved in the two cases. If this is the work of a serial killer, then it's likely he only stopped because he moved to another area, or is in prison for another crime that wouldn't have required him to give a DNA sample. According to Texas law, DNA samples only have to be taken from those who have committed violent crimes. If they've been charged in a court of law, that is. If a person hasn't been convicted in a court of law, then DNA will only be taken if that person has previous convictions for a similar offense. Texas law also dictates that a DNA sample can be obtained if police have probable cause, and that a DNA sample can be obtained from a person who has been convicted of a felony. With this in mind, it's probable to assume that the perpetrator may be in the Texas prison system, or on an unrelated charge, as they do not fit into the above categories. Their DNA has never been obtained and uploaded to CODIS. Garland Atkinson, Andy's father, told Cron.com in 2008, quote, "We were not only father and son, but best friends as well. You see things on TV, you read things in the paper, but you never imagine something that drastic, that horrifying, happening to someone you love. When the interviewer asked him about the recent developments and the connection to Miss X's case, Garland said, quote, "It's a good thing. Even though it brings up a lot of emotions, it's one step closer." Sadly, for the families of CHERYL and Andy, there have been few updates since 2008. It may take new technological advances, such as genetic genealogy, to crack the case. The Houston Police Department firmly believes that the person responsible is still out there, and that there are other victims. Anyone with information is urged to come forward, no matter how small or insignificant you believe the information to be. It may just be the tip that blows the case open. If you have any information, you're asked to contact the Houston Police Department at 713-837-0311 or Crime Stoppers at 713-222-TIPS. Number 3. The Lufkin Fire Department was gearing up for another day on the job when a call came in on March 26, 2000. Sirens throughout the department rang out, and firefighters sprang into action. Running to their trucks, the firefighters thought that the call would be a run-of-the-mill apartment fire, and hoped and prayed that everyone inside had made it to safety. As they raced through Lufkin, they arrived at the apartment of 26-year-old Megan Curl, a lively young woman who wanted nothing more than to be accepted by the local community. The firefighters raced inside, fighting off the flames as they ran. They began to extinguish the fire, and they came across a scene that would haunt Lufkin, Texas for the next 21 years. Megan hadn't made it out of her apartment, and instead, her body lied on the bed. First attending officers were horrified. During their many years of service, they had experienced it all, but this was something very different. After ensuring that the apartment was safe to enter, the Lufkin Police Department stepped inside and began their investigation. Megan Curl was only identified by dental records due to the state of her remains, and a homicide investigation was officially opened. Megan's family were informed of the news, and devastation and anger ripped through them. They wondered who could have done something so evil to a woman who just wanted to be accepted and loved. Sadly, 21 years later, Megan's case continues to baffle experts. 26-year-old Megan Curl, also known as Megan Romero, had lived in Lufkin, Texas, since she was a teenager and was familiar with the area. During her time at high school, Megan was diagnosed with a mild learning disability, and her family hoped that despite this, she would be able to live a happy and fulfilled life. Other students at her high school weren't so kind and teased Megan. Her mother, Sherry, told Unsolved Mysteries, quote, "She wasn't always accepted. People would make fun of her, put her down, and she'd always come back with a kind word for them." Throughout her adolescence and into adulthood, Megan did anything she could to be accepted by others. Her mother, Sherry, noted that she was naive and far too trusting of people, which led Megan to meet some unsavory characters. When she was 18, Megan got married and moved to Arkansas with her husband. However, the marriage didn't last, and soon after, she found herself right back in Lufkin, Texas. When speaking to Unsolved Mysteries, Sherry, Megan's mother, said, quote, "Because Megan was so trusting and was so outgoing, she tended to be an easy target for some of these men. Men absolutely could tell that Megan wanted to please, that Megan wanted somebody to care for her, and that she was lonely. And I think that this is part of what happened here." End quote. In order to ascertain what happened to Megan on March 26, 2000, investigators backtracked and created a timeline of events from the night before. We know that on March 25, 2000, Megan went to the Electric Cowboy Bar. Regulars at the bar knew Megan and said that it wasn't unusual to see her there every Friday and Saturday night, dancing the night away. Megan usually turned up to the bar alone and danced with some of the regulars before calling it a night and heading home. But the night of March 25th was different. Those at the bar that night recalled seeing Megan dancing with an unknown man who caught the attention of eagle-eyed regulars. The Electric Cowboy wasn't a spot frequented by those just passing through Lufkin, and it was unusual to see an unfamiliar face there. This unknown man and Megan decided to dance, but at some point during the night, Megan was asked to leave for unknown reasons. This struck regulars as unusual as well, as Megan wasn't a known troublemaker, and was always kind and courteous to other patrons at the bar. After being asked to leave the Electric Cowboy, Megan made her way to the Sports Shack and was seen talking to several people, having a few drinks. Megan spent the next few hours dancing before finally deciding to call it a night. She accepted a ride with one of the bar's employees, and sadly, they would be the last person to see her alive. Megan arrived at her apartment complex at 1:30 a.m., and as she was wearily making her way up to her apartment, she bumped into a friend who also lived in the same complex. The woman, whose name has been withheld, told Unsolved Mysteries that it was a common occurrence for the two women to chat in the early hours of the morning after they had both been out. The friend kept a close eye on Megan and always made sure to check on her. As the two were talking, a car hurled into the apartment's car park, with Megan indicating that the man driving the car was someone she had met at the bar earlier that night. The friend told Unsolved Mysteries, quote, "Well, we were standing out there talking, and all of a sudden, there's this guy in his car, and he was speeding really fast, and he just did a dead stop. I went back to the apartment, and then I went back out. The car was still there, but neither of them were. They were gone." End quote. For a while, the friend left Megan and the mysterious man to it, but as the minutes ticked by, she sensed that something wasn't quite right. The friend left her apartment, put on her shoes, and went over to Megan's apartment to make sure that she was safe. At around 2 to 2:30 a.m., the friend went to Megan's apartment and knocked on the door. As she stood and waited, she looked at the car in the car park and couldn't help but feel that something was off. Megan answered the door and told her friend that everything was okay. She said, "I was all right, it was my friend from the club. And I looked down to him and he just nodded his head slowly and didn't say a word. And I didn't speak to him at all either. I said, 'Well, are you sure you're okay?' And she said, 'Yes, I'm fine.'" The two friends said goodnight to one another, and Megan slowly closed the apartment door. The friend didn't know it yet, but she would be the last person to see Megan alive. Megan's friend awoke the next morning to plumes of smoke emanating from Megan's apartment. Her heart sank as she realized that her worst fears may have come true. She rushed over to Megan's apartment and got as close as she could before officers broke the devastating news to her. The unnamed woman spoke with first responding police officers and told them about the strange encounter she'd had early in the morning hours. The woman was able to work with police and a sketch artist to create an approximation sketch. She described the man as white with blonde hair, a light mustache, and gold-rimmed glasses. By the time the Lufkin Police Department had arrived, the car was long gone, and the fire that had been set in Megan's apartment had all but destroyed any shred of evidence that the unknown man may have left behind. The Lufkin Police Department believed that Megan knew the man as remains of a nightgown were found with her body. Lieutenant David Young told the show Unsolved Mysteries, quote, "In interviewing men from her past, we learned that her normal sleeping attire would be something along the lines of shorts and a t-shirt. But if she were going to be romantically involved, she would sometimes wear a nightgown. We feel that because of that, she knew this person and was preparing for an intimate evening with him." End quote. Patrons of the Electric Cowboy were interviewed and told the Lufkin police that they saw Megan talking with an unknown man throughout the night. Lieutenant Young said, quote, "That man did buy her 1 or 2 drinks. No one at the club knew who this man was, and no one reported seeing him since." Nobody present that night recalled seeing Megan arguing with anyone or getting into any kind of disagreement. The Lufkin Police Department asked this question as they believed that the crime perpetrated against Megan was fueled by hatred or anger. Many of the details in Megan's case are too gruesome to mention, and all of the signs point towards a vengeful lover or someone who had been scorned by Megan. The question was, who? The Lufkin Police Department also turned their attention to Megan's ex-husband. Megan's family alleges that the relationship was volatile and that her husband mistreated her. This caused Megan to call off the marriage and move back to Lufkin. Her family made several offers for her to live with them, but Megan was fiercely independent and insisted that she wanted her own apartment. The Lufkin Police Department quickly found themselves at a dead end with Megan's case. Nobody apart from Megan recognized the man in her apartment, and without so much as a name, forensic investigators are clinging to the hope that DNA will finally bring about answers to one of Lufkin's most mysterious unsolved crimes. Megan's family are desperate for answers, and Sherry, Megan's mother, hopes that one day the right person will come forward and finally put to bed the horrific crime perpetrated against her only daughter. Anyone with information is asked to come forward, no matter how small or insignificant the information may seem to be. It may just be the tip that brings this case to a resolution. If you have any information, you're asked to contact the Lufkin Police Department at 936-634-8881 or the Lufkin Crime Stoppers at 639-TIPS. Number 2. On June 23, 1965, the Houston Police Department was called to 1815 Driscoll Street, the home of Fred Rogers and Edwina Rogers, to perform a welfare check. Their nephew Marvin had called the Houston Police Department after he hadn't heard from his aunt or uncle for a few days, and was concerned that his calls were going unanswered. Marvin feared that there may have been a medical emergency at the home, and as Fred and Edwina were 81 and 73, they may have been unable to call for help due to their old age and ailing health. Houston Police Captain Charles Bullock and his partner L.M. Barda responded to the call and drove to the Rogers home at 1815 Driscoll Street. Marvin informed the officers that the couple's son, Charles, also lived in the house, but he was a recluse, and it was unlikely he would answer the door. He told officers that his cousin was strange and only communicated with his parents by slipping notes under his door in order to get food and water. Charles's behavior was odd, but to the police, it wasn't a cause for concern right away. That attitude changed very quickly once the Houston police stepped inside the Rogers' house of horrors. The two officers approached the front door, giving a firm knock to alert Fred and Edwina of their presence. They stood back from the door and waited to be greeted, but the door never opened. After giving it a few more taps, they realized that nobody was going to answer and decided to head around to the back of the house to see if there was another way in. Bullock and Barda made their way to the back of the house and immediately noticed that the back door had been barricaded by flower pots, which immediately sent alarm bells ringing. The pair barged their way past the poorly built barricade and found themselves in the kitchen of the home. Bullock recalled, quote, "My suspicions shifted into adrenaline. Something just didn't feel right." Something inside of Bullock told him to open the fridge. Even decades later, he still can't quite put his finger on why he did it, but he just knew that a feeling inside of him insisted upon it. Inside the fridge were the remains of Fred and Edwina. The two officers thought they were at first looking at Rogers' groceries, but it soon became apparent that something terrible had happened inside the Rogers' home. Bullock and Barda were too stunned to speak. They ran out of the house back to their patrol car and immediately radioed for backup. It was like nothing either of them had ever seen before, and a scene that they hoped they would never see again. Soon, the Houston Police Department, along with forensic investigators, had surrounded the home, and neighbors began flooding into the street, wondering what all the commotion was. The Houston Police Department ordered the neighbors to stand back, and within a matter of hours, a homicide investigation was opened. When the press got a hold of the story, they ran with the name the Icebox Murders, a name that has stuck with the case for over 56 years. A basic forensic examination of the house pointed to one suspect, Charles Rogers, who was 43 years old, Fred and Edwina's son. As previously mentioned, Charles was a recluse who once had a promising future ahead of him. He had served in World War II in the United States Navy and was regarded as an intelligent and hard-working young man. He had obtained a degree in nuclear physics and had once worked with an oil company, earning good money and firmly setting himself on a career ladder. That all changed in 1957 when he quit his job without reason and began associating with the wrong crowd. It's alleged that Charles had somehow gotten himself involved in the CIA's plot to get rid of JFK. And as we know, JFK passed away in Dallas, Texas in November of 1963. There aren't any concrete facts to back up this allegation, and all of this information comes from a 1992 book, The Man on the Grassy Knoll by Philip Rogers and John R. Craig. According to this book, Charles Rogers was one of the 3 tramps arrested on Dealey Plaza, following the events of 11/22/63. But again, this remains a conspiracy theory. In the book, author Philip Rogers writes that Charles Rogers was a covert agent of the CIA. He claims he was recruited in 1956 in Houston. At first, he was a contract agent, but then he was reassigned from Shell Oil, and he became a full-time operative in Latin American activities. They believed the motive for the crime was to silence them, because they believed that his mother, at the very least, found out that he was involved in a conspiracy against JFK a year and a half before. The duo go on to explain that Charles had kept a detailed diary of the events leading up to 11/22/63, and that Edwina had come across this and had threatened some sort of action. Again, there's no evidence to prove that Charles had kept a diary or that he was involved with the CIA. There is evidence that Charles spoke several languages and loved ham radios and often communicated with people in Latin America, but that doesn't prove that he was a CIA operative. The theory put forward by Craig and Rogers is that following his crime, Charles fled to Mexico, Honduras, or somewhere in Latin America and became a ghost. Forensic accountants Hugh and Martha Gardner also put forward a theory, but this time they had evidence to support their claims. During their investigation, they uncovered evidence that Fred and Edwina had taken all of his savings without his consent and had generally subjected him to a miserable existence. Could all of this be the true motive behind the crime? The Gardners also suggest that after his parents were gone, Charles left the USA and fled to Mexico to lay low and start a new life. With Charles being the only suspect in their investigation, the case quickly ran cold and the Houston Police Department found themselves at a loss. This was by far one of the most mysterious and confusing cases they had ever dealt with, and 56 years later, they're still no closer to cracking the case. Charles Rogers was never charged or convicted of the crime, but he is considered the only suspect and person of interest. In 1975, Charles Rogers was declared deceased in absence, and the Rogers estate was divided up between the surviving family members. Since that fateful day in 1965, there has been no sign of Charles, and if alive today, he would turn 100 years old on December 30th. The case may be decades old, but the surviving members of the Rogers family and their children are still desperately looking for answers. They want to know who and why. If Charles is responsible, they want to know why he acted so callously towards his parents, and they want to be able to put to bed the bizarre conspiracy theories that surround his name. The Rogers' family simply want to put the case to rest once and for all, and have something they haven't had for 56 years: closure. Anyone with information is asked to come forward, no matter how small that information may be. If you have information, you're asked to contact the Houston Police Department at 713-837-0311 or Crime Stoppers at 713-222-TIPS. Number 1. 39-year-old Pamela McDonald was a lovely stay-at-home mother with 3 beautiful children, and she dedicated her life to ensuring that her children had everything they needed. According to Charles, her husband, Pamela loved to take late-night drives once all of her children were sound asleep in bed, using the drive to get some much-needed time alone, taking solace in the silence. Pamela always returned after her drives, oftentimes feeling refreshed and ready to take on whatever was ahead of her. On April 2nd, 2009, Pamela hopped into her car and went for one last drive, both figuratively and literally. At around 1 a.m., Charles said goodbye to his wife and watched as she headed out of the front door and into her beloved silver Lincoln Town Car. According to an MRT article, her car was due to be repossessed on April 3rd, 2009, and Pamela wanted to have one last drive. The McDonald family were facing financial issues in the months before Pamela's disappearance, and this had put a dark cloud over Pamela and Charles. The two carried on, making sure that their children had everything they needed, and battled with the bills. There's a lack of information in Pamela's case, save for a few news articles and appeals by the Midland County Sheriff's Office and the Midland Crime Stoppers. But from the information that we do have, it appeared that Pamela was a dedicated mother who had no reason to disappear. Pamela drove away from her home in Midland County, Texas, for what would be the last time. Inside, Charles had no idea that he had just said his final goodbyes. Charles waited for that familiar hum of Pamela's engine and the sound of her tires slowly traversing the driveway. But instead, he was met with silence, and the night passed without any sign of Pamela. 3 days had passed, and Charles still hadn't heard from his wife. His anxiety turned to concern, and he was out of excuses for his children as to where their mother was. On April 5th, 2009, Charles McDonald picked up the phone, dialed 911, and asked to speak to the sheriff's office. After a brief exchange, he informed the operator that he wished to report his wife as missing, and began relaying the details of that fateful night. Deputies were dispatched to the McDonald home and took statements from Charles and worked with him to figure out where Pamela may have gone. Charles knew that her car was being repossessed and that they were in a period of financial difficulty, but he also knew that Pamela wouldn't leave the children behind. On April 14, 2009, Pamela's distinctive silver Lincoln Town Car with a large tiger sticker on the back window and Texas license plates was found abandoned in a rest area car park situated off mile marker 70 on Interstate 20. The Texas Rangers who discovered the abandoned car had noticed its presence since April 4th, 2009 and decided to run the plates. It was then that Pamela's missing person report popped up alongside the ownership details. The Texas Rangers had already been contacted by the Midland County Sheriff's Office, who were asking for their assistance in the case. When the Texas Ranger discovered Pamela's car, he contacted the Midland County Sheriff's Office, and a collaborative effort to find Pamela continued. The Texas Ranger noted that Pamela's car was locked and her keys were not in or around it. During a preliminary examination, no faults were found with the car, and it didn't appear to have been involved in an accident. In fact, one Texas Ranger commented, "It just looks like whoever stepped out of the car vanished." According to press releases, there was no activity on her phone before or after her disappearance, and there was no reason to believe that Pamela had disappeared voluntarily. It's unknown whether any forensic evidence was recovered from the car, and investigators are keeping the details about Pamela's case very close to their chest. One article for News 9 mentions that witnesses in the area where Pamela's car was discovered off Interstate 20 said that they had seen her car since the early hours of April 2nd, which is shortly after Pamela left her home to go on a drive. This contradicts the reports by Texas Rangers. However, it's possible that the Texas Rangers didn't begin patrolling that area until April 4th. Helicopters and ground teams prepared themselves for the long search ahead of them, and in the days following the discovery of Pamela's car, they scoured the area looking for any sign of the missing woman. Sadly, their searches proved fruitless, and days later, the searches were called off. Charles McDonald awaited at the couple's Midland County home, hoping and praying that it was all a bad dream, and that he would be awoken to the sound of Pamela's engine and her keys in the door. The Midland County Sheriff's Office never faltered in their investigation into Pamela's disappearance, and went to every effort they could to find her and bring her home. On January 20th, 2012, skeletal remains were discovered in a remote oil field just north of Rankin, Upton County, Texas, which is around 50 miles from Pamela's Midland County home, and around 70 miles from where her car was found abandoned. Unbeknownst to the officers and forensic investigators who attended the scene, they had just uncovered the remains of missing 39-year-old Pamela McDonald. It took almost a year for the anthropologist to identify the remains as Pamela McDonald, and the news was relayed to the Midland County Sheriff's Office and Pamela's family. Now the missing person case had devolved and taken a dark turn, and the Midland County Sheriff's Office began looking deeper into Charles McDonald. However, a lack of evidence has stifled the case, and the only real suspect is her husband. No arrests have ever been made, and any further details of Pamela's case have never been released to the public. Whether this means the Midland County Sheriff's Office are playing their cards close to their chests, or that they don't have any more information remains unknown. No details surrounding the 2012 discovery and forensic investigation have ever been released, and we're left wondering what happened to Pamela McDonald under the cloak of darkness on April 2nd, 2009. The Midland County Sheriff's Office has only named Charles McDonald as a suspect. However, there's never been enough evidence to arrest or convict him, and he's presumed innocent until otherwise proven guilty. Pamela's family are desperate for answers. In the 12 years that she's been gone, her children have grown up and are now fighting to keep their mother's case in the spotlight. There's currently a $3,000 reward for information that leads to an arrest. Pamela's case remains one of the most bizarre unsolved mysteries in Midland County history, and it continues to baffle investigators over 12 years later. If you have any information about Pamela or the case, you're asked to contact the Texas Rangers at 1-800-346-3243, Crime Stoppers at 432-333-TIPS, the Midland County Sheriff's Office at 432-742-7777, or the Midland Crime Stoppers at 432-964-TIPS. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.